All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our Wednesday Wisdom session. Today, we're going to talk about zero-day remediation. My name is Eyal Golombek. I'm the Director of Product Management here at DAZ, and I'm excited to have you all in our session. This is a really great way to talk about interesting topics around security, cloud security, and remediation. And today I want to dive deep into a very interesting topic about 0 days and how to respond and remediate whenever an event occurs. We're going to talk a little bit about response strategies and some of the great tips and tactics that we have discovered here in DAS. So hope you're going to enjoy that, and hope we also see you in our future sessions as well. All right, so let's just start with a quick recap of the year that we've just had, the year 2022, and all the major events that happened. And I think most of you will be very familiar with those events. So very very early, actually, end of 2021, the world has seen the very famous Log4Shell vulnerability come out. This was an extremely unique and very critical event, very critical risk vulnerability that came out, was revealed very quickly, and actually introduced a huge amount of risk to the entire internet. And actually a lot of organizations, a lot of enterprises quickly realized how vulnerable they were to this new risk that was so easy to exploit. And we all probably remember what a great Christmas that was, how everybody had to take the time and step away from their family and had to work in order to remediate that, in order to make sure the organization isn't at risk and God forbid breached because of this very unique and very special vulnerability that came out. So this was the very early of 2022, hit us pretty hard. Later that year, around April, we saw another major vulnerability come out, being released, the Spring4Shell, another critical vulnerability, again in the Java world and the Java frameworks. Again, also a vulnerability that introduced a large amount of risk to a lot of organizations and required quite extensive remediation work from security teams, from application teams, from infrastructure teams. All had to put some effort in order to remediate this problem and get their organization secure. And lastly, relatively around the end of the year, around October, we saw rise to another critical security vulnerability with the OpenSSL library that released a patch that actually fixed two very high-risk critical vulnerabilities that also allowed attackers to exploit our workloads, whether in the cloud or other workloads in our on-premises environment. And again, required quite an extensive effort from security teams in order to remediate this and get their organization secure again. So this is just a very quick recap of three big events that happened last year, and just to show how often those things get and how often those things happen. Those major events, those worldwide issues that actually impact almost every organization out there, and we see that they happen quite often, and unfortunately we are expected to see even a rise in the frequency of those events. And so I'm sure a lot of security folks out there in the audience can relate to this, the amount of effort and the amount of stress that those events bring. And what we're going to talk about today is really how to work in order to remediate those in an easy way, or hopefully a much smoother way than we see organizations try today. So let's just take one of the more famous ones and really analyze the time frame and the timeline of how things underwent. So we're looking at the timeline of the very famous Log4Shell vulnerability, and I think for me this was extremely interesting to really see and grasp the progress of things, and how actually quickly things progress, as opposed to how slowly organizations deal with those risks, and how slowly it takes, how much time it takes for the security team and the defenders to actually remediate the workloads and remove the risk, as opposed to how quickly attackers move and how quickly attackers can exploit and actually take advantage of the risk and of the environment. So it all started around November of 2021, when the 0 day was first discovered by a researcher, by a research performed very privately. This was still in the dark. No one really knew about this vulnerability. It was just released as an issue in GitHub. Someone actually informed that they have discovered this problem. And the first exploit detected in the world, in the wild, was December 1st. But again, this was just a minor thing, very small, very niche problem, not the big issue that we all remember and recall. And you can see how quickly a patch was released. And this was shocking to me to see that it took just 5 days since the first exploit till a patch was actually available out there. So theoretically, the security teams could just take this patch, remediate their workloads, and that's it. The issue would be resolved, and we won't all be talking about Log4j a year and a half later. But I think what's so mind blowing is to see that the fact that there's a patch out there is just the beginning. It's not really what blocks organizations from actually reducing the risk. And so 4 days later, after the patch was released, on December 10th, the vulnerability was officially released to the world. It got a common vulnerability enumerator number, and it was called log4shell. And from a research conducted, it was shown that almost 93% of all cloud enterprises were vulnerable to this problem. So I'm sure you're all aware that Java is the language that actually log4shell is a package in. So it is very common, used by a lot of organizations. And so a very large number of enterprises were vulnerable to this very easy to exploit attack. And again, I think the big thing to understand in cloud environments is that once the CVE is released, once the vulnerability is officially released to the world, then everybody can see it. And then since in cloud environments, everything moves really fast, attackers start exploiting this vulnerability right away. So I think from all practical perspectives, this is where the risk window actually begins. Because before that, it was a very niche thing. It was a very small thing. A few researchers were aware of this problem, but the moment that CVE is released is actually when the world is aware of that, and that's when the race actually begins between the attackers and the defenders. And you can see that it's very interesting to see that when the risk window starts, we already have a fix available. We already know what we need to do. We already have the fix out there. We just need to patch it, but still, it doesn't make our lives much easier. So you can see that within 72 hours of the risk window being open, there were already recorded 830,000 exploits in the wild, over 60 different variations, meaning they're all coming from at least 60 different players that are exploiting this in order to do any cybercrime, malicious attempts, even nation state actors. So it took them only 72 hours to operationalize this, and this is how incredibly easy it was to exploit Log4j. And I think this shows how fast things move in cloud environments, and especially in this world of zero-day vulnerabilities. And so if we were used to having really slow attack vectors in the more old school on-prem environments of maybe 60 days, 90 days, some organizations have those kind of SLAs around the vulnerability patching. Here we see that 72 hours is all it took attackers to make this completely operationalized and weaponized. And so things have to move much, much faster in the cloud environment and in modern environments today. And you can see that 10 days later, which means a lot of time that attackers could exploit this, 10 days later, only 40% of cloud workloads were patched. So the risk window is still open. 60% of cloud workloads are still vulnerable, still being exploited. And this is 10 days after the exploit, after the official release. Let's jump forward into the future, and we see that 7 months later, around September of 2022, the NSA reports that nation state actors are still exploiting Log4Shell for data extortion attacks and are still utilizing it in a very free and easy manner. And 8 months later, a research showed that 72% of the organizations are still vulnerable to Log4Shell, even though there is a patch out there, even though 8 months have passed. most organizations still are not able to completely reduce the risk window and make sure that they're no longer vulnerable to this so easy to exploit vulnerability. And I think this is extremely interesting to dive deep into, because when looking at it from a very shallow perspective, it looks like there's a patch, right? You can just bump the version, remove the vulnerability, and make sure you're no longer at risk. So why are organizations not able to remove this risk 8 months, and now that we're almost a year and a half after that, still a lot of organizations are vulnerable? And so this question comes up as to why this happens. And so we see a few major factors that cause organizations to struggle with remediating and closing the risk window. And first of all, the main problem is that there's too many alerts. A lot of organizations have detection tools alerting on the issue, and of course, whenever such a big event happens, like Log4Shell, detection tools immediately release a lot of new detections. Usually, it's very chaotic. Usually, there's a lot of new alerts, a lot of new noise, and so there's a massive input of alerts that actually do alert on real vulnerable assets, but just overloaded and overcrowded with a lot of noise. And there's no really clear way to prioritize between different alerts coming from different tools. For example, should I prioritize an alert coming from my code scanner, or should I prioritize the one that comes from my container scanner? Or maybe it's better to look at my cloud scanner, my runtime scanner. Usually organizations have multiple scanners. They all do a good job of trying to catch up with this new zero-day vulnerability, but then you end up with having duplicates, with having a lot of noise, with having thousands or tens of thousands of alerts of a very extremely critical vulnerability, and there's no easy way to manage this massive amount of data. The second big problem that we see that organizations tackle when trying to close the risk window around zero-day vulnerabilities is the problem of ownership. And in a lot of cases, when you have detection tools scanning your runtime environment, your cloud environment, they might detect vulnerable assets that are vulnerable to this very important risk that we need to remediate. However, you don't really know who owns this machine, who owns this container. Maybe you don't have a good tagging in place. Maybe there is no clear way to understand what this workload belongs to. In the cloud environment, things go up, things go down, everything is ephemeral. And so this becomes a very a hot potato that everybody tries to throw out to the next person, and no one takes ownership because it's very hard to understand who owns it. And so a lot of organizations spend huge amounts of time and money in trying to figure out who owns what, just so they can apply the fix. Another big problem that we see out there is the process of investigation. So let's assume that some detection tool alerted on a workload in the cloud that's vulnerable for this let's take Log4Shell, for example. Then figuring out where this workload came from, what is the code that created it, whether it was manually deployed, whether it's managed by some sort of infrastructure as code, whether it's application code, just to figure out where is this coming from, how is this deployed. This process of the investigation is a lot of time wasted, and in many cases just chasing ghosts, because cloud environments are very complex. Modern SDLCs, software development lifecycles, are very complex. A lot of tools are involved in this, and a lot of organizations spend tremendous amount of time just figuring out where is this workload coming from, how should I fix it, where should I patch it. In many cases, if you just, for example, there's a container, if you just try to patch the container, you can SSH, you can go into this container, patch it, but wait a day, this container is going to go down, a new container is going to come up, and it's going to be vulnerable again. So you got to figure out where things originate from, and this process is a lot of time wasted. And this is a big major hurdle that organizations struggle to overcome when trying to reduce their risk window. And lastly, a big problem that we see is that in modern environments and cloud environments, usually there's a big lack into the software development lifecycle context. Again, as I said, those software development lifecycles are very complex. They're filled with very elaborate tools, very modern tools that interact with one another. And it's very hard to keep track of which tool works with what tool. Usually, there are multiple teams working with multiple different tools. And so, this lack of context causes a communication gap across the organization. One team doesn't understand the landscape of the tools of another team, and in security teams is struggling to explain to the developers what they need to fix, where they need to fix it, where is it coming from. This lack of context generates a big communication gap that slows the process down and makes the remediation slow, heavy, and as we've seen, might take months, even though attackers take only a few hours to exploit those vulnerabilities. So those are the challenges that we see, and this was very interesting to me when we performed this research to see why organizations struggle with this, and it wasn't the obvious reasons. It wasn't the lack of a patch existing. So let's jump to what are the steps of a remediation program that we see that organizations take when they try to resolve and actually respond to these major events like Log4Shell when they come up. And this is a common process that I recommend every organization would take when tackling such a new event. And of course, I wish we didn't have to prepare to those events, but unfortunately, we are all sure that those would come. And so the best thing we can do is be prepared when such an event happens. And so a solid problem and the steps of such a problem would be, first of all, of course, you need to have detection in place. So most organizations have detection tools out there, and most detection tools would quickly adapt to such a new zero-day vulnerability and release their detections out. So even if you don't have such an elaborate detection tool, there are a lot of great open source tool out there that would do almost as good in detecting those zero-day vulnerabilities. And so having the right detection tools is extremely important. And these days, a lot of things that we see is that security teams struggle with making sure that the detection tools that they bought are actually being used in the right way. And so a big thing that we recommend is that you govern the usage of the tools in the right place. Make sure that the tools you bought actually scan the right workloads in all of your environment, and actually you don't have any gaps in the coverage. Also, it's important to have tools all across the software development lifecycle, since some tools might miss vulnerabilities that others might catch. And it's important to have coverage all across the process to catch things as early as possible. So once you've got the detection out there laid out, and once you've got it covering all of your environment, the next thing would be prioritization. So now that your tools are detecting a lot of issues, you want to start and figure what you want to tackle first. And so we understand that in order to really prioritize between the different tools, you need to really understand the full context of how issues come into play and how things go from code to cloud. Because again, if you have some code scanner scanning your environment and detecting some zero-day vulnerability, and then you have a cloud scanner detecting the zero-day vulnerability, how do you prioritize between the two? What's more important? Should I fix here or should I fix there? What environment is this running on? And so the entire context is extremely important for prioritization. And also, in order to prioritize, you want to also reduce the noise dramatically by deduplicating, again, because you have multiple tools alerting on the problem, and in many cases there are duplicates. In many cases, even the same tool generate duplicates because it lacks the context. In many cases, you might have in the cloud ephemeral resources that go up and down and up and down, and the detection tool might say that you have 1,000 vulnerable assets while it's just one ephemeral workload going up and down. And so deduplicating, correlating, and contextualizing alerts is extremely important when you want to prioritize and make sure that you focus only on what matters most, especially in those time critical situations where attackers take very few hours in order to exploit those 0 days, and defenders actually need a lot of time in order to make sure that they reduce the risk 100%. The next phase would be investigation. So after you've detected the issues, you've prioritized them by the context, by the full SDLC context, You want to investigate each and every one of those issues in order to understand what is the root cause of each alert. You want to be able to fix things at the root, again, in order to prevent the recurrence of things. You want to be able to identify how to fix things and where to fix those, in what point, where is the line of code I need to change, what's the configuration I need to change. It's not enough to just get some detection telling you, well, you've got a vulnerable workload. Now you got to perform a very lengthy investigation of saying, well, where is it coming from? Where should I fix it? And lastly, in this process of an investigation, you want to be able to identify the relevant person in the organization that should be tasked with patching, with remediating, with taking ownership on their own workloads and making sure that the patch is completely deployed and doesn't break anything in the environment. Lastly, once you've detected, prioritized, and investigated, you want to start communicating this process and manage this process all across the organization. So there's a lot of development teams. There's the security team, there's management that want to stay on top of everything. And so being able to track the remediation progress is very important, so you can communicate that both to management and to all the business departments that are working on fixing their environment. And being able to communicate the relevant fix to the relevant person very quickly is extremely important and saves a lot of time in driving this remediation program and making sure you hit the spot of remediating quickly enough so you don't get breached. And so this is a general process that we recommend when tackling this a new zero-day vulnerability should it come. And I want to show you an example of an organization that was able to perform the remediation of Log4Shell in just 4 days when following those very clear steps and using some of our very interesting technology that helps automate a lot of those steps and make sure that those steps take way less time than they usually take organizations. And so you can see an example here of an organization that was vulnerable to Log4Shell, and actually they were an organization working in AWS. They were highly containerized, so most of the workloads were containerized. And so using a lot of the techniques and the tips that we talked about earlier, they were able to completely reduce the risk window within just 4 days. Now compare that to the 8 month that 72% of the organization are still vulnerable. This is a great benchmark to hit when trying to mitigate the risk as fast as possible. And so the example here, you can see that this organization had almost 18,000 issues in their AWS environment that were all vulnerable to Log4Shell. So those were containers that part of them were in Kubernetes, part of them were using other technologies of deploying containers in AWS. And they were going up, they were going down, there were multiple workloads, things were horizontally scaling, things were vertically scaling. And so there was a lot of workloads and a lot of mess and continuity in the cloud, which is inherent to cloud environments, that introduced almost 18,000 issues. Now, a very important part of what we talked about is prioritizing and being able to know and understand out of all this noise, what's actually things I need to fix. And so using our product, using DAS and our root cause analysis engine, they were able to understand that there are only 673 affected container images in this case that are actually vulnerable to Log4Shell. And those container images are deployed over and over again, causing the 17,000 issues. And so this is the first step of being able to noise reduce and identify the real things that are actually actionable things that we can remediate upon. The next thing is to perform the investigation. And so using DAS, they were able to automatically skip this investigation phase and make it just completely automatic. So DAS was able to identify that out of the 673 affected images, they all originate from Docker files. So again, Docker files is the configuration of container images. It's the way that you configure an image. And so DAS was able to automatically find those Docker files, which are code files stored in code repositories maintained by developers. And so DAS performed this automatically. And this even reduced the amount of work even more, because those Docker files were used over and over again because they had base images, they had duplicity, as very common in modularity that is very common in modern environments. And so this is the investigation part, and this led to the ability to automatically identify the owners, which again is a big gap when trying to tackle major remediation programs. And so DAS automatically identified 37 individuals out of the entire organization that actually own almost all of the risk that Log4Shell is introducing. And so they were able to then communicate this to the relevant people very easily using ticketing systems, using emails, using reporting, anything that's needed in order to ask those 37 people, please address this very big risk. And so by performing those steps, they were able to close the risk window with just 4 days. Which is a much better starting point in order to deal with those huge events that come out in the wild and really introduce large amounts of risk very quickly to large organizations. And so lastly, I just want to emphasize some key elements for a successful remediation strategy when you want to build your strategy and be prepared for the next, God forbid, Log4Shell. So very simply put, you want to start with governing your detection tools coverage. So you want to make sure that tools that you've bought, the tools that you have in place, actually do the work that they need to do and actually cover the environment that you have. So in many cases, we see organizations that have bought very expensive tools, but those tools scan only 35%, 40% of their posture, whether it's code repositories that are just hidden and are not being scanned, even cloud subscriptions that are not being scanned correctly. And then you just won't be able to detect the risk as needed, even though you've bought very expensive tools. So this is a very important step. The next very important element that we recommend is making sure that you reduce the noise and don't handle all of the alerts that come out of those tools, because this is just a ridiculously large amount of data coming out of those tools. And you've got to start by reducing the noise, by correlating the symptoms that come from different tools from different parts of your SDLC, and being able to reduce it to a much more manageable number of issues that can actually be resolved within a few days and not years. The next thing is to make sure you perform a clever root cause analysis and don't just chase each and every data point that comes out of those detection tools, because by performing those clever root cause analysis, you usually identify massively impactful remediation actions. Usually you would identify one application or one piece of code that is multiplied over and over again and is the one that introduces the problem. Maybe it's a container-based image, maybe it's a code module. But usually, if you dig deep enough, you would find those that fixing them takes a small effort, generates large impact. And lastly, we understand that the software development lifecycle context is extremely important for the success of the remediation program. And so you want to generate this context for the developers, for the business, such that for every different alert, you're able to streamline the fix, identify the owner, and you want to give that owner all the context they need in order to successfully remediate the problem. Because even though there's a patch out there available, and we've seen how quickly patches get released, even though there's a patch out there, doesn't mean it's easy for them to quickly streamline the fix, because they need so much more context in order to understand where the fix, what they need to fix, why they need to fix it, and what is the impact of the fix that they're going to implement. So those are the 4 key elements that we recommend for a good remediation strategy when dealing with the next zero-day vulnerability. So I hope that you enjoyed this session. I hope that you've learned and that have enriched your knowledge about how to handle zero-day vulnerabilities, how to handle those issues when they occur. Hopefully you can take those tips and be more prepared for the next event, God forbid that happens. If you're interested to learn more about how we do that in DAS and how our platform can help you perform all those steps automatically, save the time and money, and of course, reduce the risk whenever such an event occurs, then please feel free to contact us, and we'd love to share more about our capabilities and the product that we've built. Always excited to help more organizations be more secure. And if you found this interesting, please join our next Wednesday wisdom sessions. And thanks again for coming today.